Hi guys, here's the video that goes over day 1 of our functions unit, operations and composition of functions. So after this video is over, you should be able to perform basic function operations like adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, as well as taking the composition of two functions. So the first thing we're going to look at are a few definitions. So we have the sum, difference, product, and quotient of functions. So let's get used to the notation. So I have the sum is f plus g of x. We can write that another way. We can write it as f of x plus g of x. So please be careful with this notation over here. That does not mean that you're multiplying by x. It just means you're adding the two functions together. Underneath that we have f minus g of x, which we can write as f of x minus g of x. Underneath that you're multiplying your two functions, and underneath that it's the quotient of two functions. So those are the basic operations for functions: adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. We also have something called the composition. So suppose f and g are functions such that the range of g is a subset of the domain of f, then the composite function f of g can be described by the equation f of g of x or f of g of x. So there's two different ways you can write this. You can write this with the open circle, or you can write it as the function inside a function. But basically what this means is you are evaluating g of x first. That comes up with some number or a function, and then that becomes the input to your f function. So with the composition, your output of one function becomes the input of the next function. So let's start working with a couple functions. So there's three different functions that we have for this example. We have f of x, which is x squared plus x minus 20. We have g of x, which is this table. And we have h of x, which is this graph. So there's three different ways that you can represent a function. You can represent it as an equation, a table, and a graph. So for letter A, we're finding f of 2 and g of negative 2 and adding those two values together. So let's go ahead and start by finding f of 2. So what's inside your parentheses is always your x. I'm going to take that and plug it into my function. So that's 2 squared plus 2 minus 20. So I have 2 squared plus 2 minus 20 is negative 14. So that means f of 2 is negative 14. And we are taking that and adding it to g of negative 2. So g is your table. I'm going to look at my table, g of negative 2. That negative 2 is your x. So when my x is negative 2, my g of negative 2 is negative 6. So that's your corresponding y. So that means g of negative 2 is negative 6. So I have negative 14 plus negative 6. I can go ahead and combine those two, which gives me negative 20. And that is your final answer. So you're starting by evaluating each individual function first, and then performing the actual operation that it says to do for the original problem. For letter B, I have f minus h of negative 4, so please be careful. You're not taking f minus h and multiplying it by negative 4. This is the same thing as f of negative 4 minus h of negative 4. So I can take negative 4 and plug it into my f function. So I'm going to find f of negative 4 first. That gives me negative 4 squared plus negative 4 minus 20. Now when you're putting that into the calculator, just make sure you put negative 4 in parentheses before you square it. And then that gives you negative 8. And for h of negative 4, so h is your graph. So when you're finding values for your graph, don't forget what's inside your parenthesis, that's your x. So I'm going to go to negative 4 on my x, and I'm going to see where that actually hits your graph. So at negative 4, my graph is at negative 2. So that means h of negative 4 is negative 2. Now your original problem says to take f of negative 4, which is negative 8, minus h of negative 4, which is negative 2. So that gives me negative 8 minus negative 2 is negative 8 plus 2, which is negative 6. Alright, for letter C, I'm going to start by finding g of 0. So g, once again, is your table. So I'm going to find g of 0, which is negative 4, just looking at that table when x is 0. I am also going to find h of 0. So h of 0, I'm looking at my graph when my x is 0. Now when your x is 0, you have two options because you have 2 points on your graph. But if you'll notice, the one that's up at 4 is an open circle, and the one that's at 0 is the closed circle. You always want to pick the one that has the closed circle because that's where your value for 0 is actually included. So my h of 0 is 0. Now going back to my original problem, it was 3 times g of 0, which we know is negative 4, minus 5 times h of 0, which we know is 0. So 3 times negative 4 is negative 12, minus 0 is just negative 12. For C through F, we're now working with the composition of functions. So we're still working with the same functions. We have our f of x, which is the equation. We have our g of x, which is the table. And we have h of x, which is the graph. So the composition means the output of one function becomes the input of the next function. So the notation for the composition is the open circle. Or if you look at letter D, you have the function inside another function. So both of those denote the composition. So you always start with your rightmost function first. So I'm going to start with my g of 2. So I'm going to evaluate that first. So g of 2, since it's a table, I'm going to look at my table. When x is 2, my y is negative 2. So this output, that negative 2, becomes the input for my next function, which is the f function. So now I'm going to take negative 2 and plug it into my x function, or my f function. So I have negative 2 squared plus negative 2 minus 20. And let's go ahead and evaluate that. So negative squared plus negative 2 minus 20 is negative 18. And then that is your final answer. So the number that you get in the very end after taking the outputs and putting them into your new function, that's your final answer. For letter D, I'm going to start with g of 0 first, because you always start with your rightmost function. So g of 0, looking at my table, g of 0 is negative 4. So this becomes the input for the next function. So now I'm going to take f of negative 4. So I have negative 4 squared plus negative 4 minus 20, which is negative 8. Letter E, we're doing the same thing. I'm going to start with h of negative 3. So h is your graph. So on my graph, I'm going to go over to negative 3. Now negative 3, once again, has two options. Okay, you always go with the one that's the closed circle. So the one that I'm picking is down here at negative 2. So h of negative 3 is negative 2. And then that becomes the input for the next function. So now I'm finding g of negative 2. Now be careful because that negative 2 is an x. So I'm looking up here. Don't look at that negative 2 because that's actually a y. So my x is negative 2 for g. The output is negative 6. And sometimes you can use the same function over and over, so I'm going to start by finding f of negative 10. So I'm going to take that and plug it in. So I have negative 10 squared plus negative 10 plus 20. So it's 100. Oh, it's minus 20, not plus 20. There you go. So that's 100 minus 30, which is 70. And then that becomes the input for my next function. But once again, our next function is just the f function. So I can take 70 and plug it in for x into my f function. So I have 70 squared plus 70 minus 20 is 4,950. So that's working with the functions with numerical values. Now we're going to look at the functions with just regular functions, so just expressions. So letter A, I'm taking 2 times f of x minus 3 times g of x. So f of x is x squared plus x minus 20. G of x is x minus 4. So when I'm rewriting this, I'm just going to put the correct functions in the right spot. So 2 times f of x is x squared plus x minus 20 minus 3 times g of x, which is x minus 4. That gives us 2x squared plus 2x minus 40. Once you have it set up, you're just simplifying and combining like terms. Distribute the negative 3, so that's negative 3x plus 12. Combine your like terms, so 2x squared minus 1x minus 28. And then that's your answer for letter A. So you're just putting the functions in the right spot and then just combining like terms and working through the algebra. For letter B, another way to write this is to do f of x times g of x. So you're just taking those two functions and multiplying it together. So f of x is x squared plus x minus 20. G of x is x minus 4. And then from there, we're just distributing and combining like terms. So I'm going to go ahead and distribute the x. So that's x cubed plus x squared minus 20x. Distribute the negative 4. So that's negative 4x squared minus 4x plus 80. And then combine like terms. So that's x cubed minus 3x squared minus 24x plus 80. Letter C, you're dividing, so that's the same thing as g of x divided by f of x. G of x is the x minus 4. F of x is the x squared plus x minus 20. Now, since we are dealing with a rational expression, you do want to see if that can be simplified further. So this denominator over here can actually be factored further, so I want you to factor it. So I have x minus 4 over, that can factor to x plus 5 and x minus 4. Now you want to factor it further just in case something cancels, which in this case it does. So you can see that the x minus 4s are going to cancel. Just be careful when you're writing your final answer because the x plus 5 is on the bottom of the fraction, so it needs to stay there. So I have x plus 5 on the bottom. On the top, it can't really be empty, so we put a 1 there. So it's 1 over x plus 5. Alright, now the composition of functions. So the composition of functions, not numbers anymore, of functions, you're doing the same thing, it's just that you're not plugging in numbers, you're plugging in functions. So I'm going to start with f of x first. So f of x equals, if you look up here, x squared plus x minus 20. Just like with the numbers, whatever your output is of your first function, that becomes the input of your next function. Now it looks weird because your input is not actually a number, it's a function, but that's okay. Keep in mind whatever is in that parenthesis, that is what you're replacing your x with. So going to my g function, instead of writing x, I'm now going to write it as x squared plus x minus 20. so that's what your input is, minus 4, because that's what the rest of the g function says to do. And then from there we can combine like terms. So that's x squared plus x minus 24. And for letter E, instead of starting with the f function first like we did for D, we're going to start with the g function first. So I have g of x equals x minus 4. This becomes the input for your next function. So now I'm finding f of x minus 4. I can go ahead and replace that. So that's x minus 4 squared plus x minus 4 and then minus 20. From there we're just simplifying, so x minus 4 squared, you have to rewrite it. That's x minus 4 times x minus 4. I can go ahead and combine the like terms over here, so that gives you x minus 24. You can go ahead and distribute. So I have x squared minus 4x minus 4x plus 16 plus x minus 24, and combining like terms. So x squared, 4x minus negative 4x minus 4x is negative 8x, plus x is negative 7x, and then 16 minus 24 is negative 8. Alright, you do not have to factor that or anything because it's not a fraction. We can just leave that as our answer. Alright, so that covers examples 1 and 2 from your notes for day 1. I hope that helps.